760,000 Ethiopians gave up their lives to sustain Ethiopia's freedom. And here's how it all took place. Ethiopia has an extensive and well-documented history on the global scale, and at some point in their history, they were referred to as amongst the top 4 superpowers of the world, body-bagging everyone that dared a colonial conquest upon their land. But something different happened in 1936. But before we get there, let us flash back 49 years prior, in the year 1887, where King Menelik II of Ethiopia agreed to offer up his land to the Italians to carry out whatever agenda that they may have upon Ethiopia in exchange for cash and guns. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie once said, "Be aware of the dangers of a single story. The treaty King Menelik signed was double-sided. One was in his native language of Amharic, and the other a malicious Italian interpretation. Both documents contain completely different terms. Diving into African history in regards to colonization, this tactic is not uncommon and has been used to justify several massacres on the continent. The document King Menelik signed in Amharic had nothing to do with war nor giving up his land, whilst the Italian version had all of the above. The Italians exclaimed that if their demands were not met, that it will cause Italy to lose their dignity, and in stern words, Emperor Tito Tibetul responded that we too must retain our dignity. You want other countries to see Ethiopia as your protege, but that will never be. Hold on to that. We'll be revisiting that later on, as this is a prophecy that stood the test of time. The Italians, feeling accomplished and justified, immediately commenced their colonial campaign, declaring war against Ethiopia in 1896. This was referred to as the Battle of Adla. Ethiopia had 2 tactics to defend themselves. One was to play the fool because the Italians thought that this was going to be easy breezy, lemon squeezy. I don't know if that's an Italian accent, but we'll pretend like it is and move on. You see, Ethiopia was not ignorant of the new era of warfare, and unbeknownst to the Italians, they had been stacking up on guns for quite some time, and when Italy found out, it was already too late. The other tactic Ethiopia implemented was to stretch Italy as thin as possible. They permitted the Italians to proceed further and further into Ethiopia to deplete their supplies of food, water, and ammunitions in preparation for a counterattack. The Italians grew wary, thirsty, hungry, and this was Ethiopia's cue for requital. This was an embarrassing defeat to the Italians, a defeat that came by the hands of a people that they deemed inferior to themselves. Pause. This is more serious than you think. Ethiopia's victory sparked mass protests in Italy. The Italians protested the government's failure to implement colonial policies, and it also caused the Prime Minister of Italy to resign, leading to a change in the Italian government. How? How can a proud European power like Italy lose to a people like Ethiopia? Italy quickly became the laughingstock of Europe, being referred to as Europe's soft underbelly. Hold on to that. We'll talk about that more later on. Once again, a new era of warfare had evolved, the likes of which no other country outside of Europe was prepared for. The Italians regrouped, and a few decades later, in the year 1935, returned with a force of 500,000 men and hundreds of aircrafts, flooding the land with poisonous gas, and for this, Ethiopia was not prepared for, because they had made the single most crucial mistake almost every African colony had made. Trust. They trusted that the international community will stay true to their word to prevent the pursuing impending injustice that Italy was soon to embark on against Ethiopia. But the contrary was so. Bordering colonial powers prevented the supply of goods into Ethiopia, further weakening the country, and in retrospect, this was naive and a grave mistake that cost Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia everything. But you cannot completely blame him for this, because this time period in history was quite different. This was the period of the League of Nations, the first worldwide intergovernmental organization whose principal mission was to maintain world peace. This was the same body that brought an end to World War I. The League of Nations sorta evolved into the United Nations as we know today, and at the time, the job of the League of Nations was to maintain peace, stability, and to settle any impending disputes between rival countries. Yes, the world had changed, But this still was a time where Africans were not viewed as humans, and despite the League of Nations' mission to maintain world peace, this did not include Africa. Its members consisted of colonial countries who presided over the most brutal and diabolical regimes on the African continent. And of the 63 countries in the League of Nations, none of them were African, well, except Liberia and South Africa. And we all know why. The League of Nations permitted Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, into Ethiopia. They were an accomplice to the genocide carried out, and they also restricted Ethiopia from defending themselves. Ethiopia subsequently fell to a more superior power. Italy won the war. The countries that were part of the League of Nations prevented supplies from entering Ethiopia. They also turned a blind eye to Emperor Haile Selassie's request for justice. Emperor Selassie said, "Today it is us, and tomorrow it will be you." Another prophecy that stood the test of time. Personally, I would conclude that this was not just a battle of Italy against Ethiopia, but Ethiopia against Europe. Ethiopia was alone. They had suffered mass casualties from the previous wars declared against them. They had no supplies of weapons to defend themselves. They were recovering from a famine, and all odds were against Ethiopia. After the war, Italian presence in Ethiopia was accompanied by the destruction of property and the murder of hundreds of thousands of people, with attacks targeting notable figures in Ethiopian societies. These include the most educated and religious leaders. Please permit me to digress to make an important point. The only reason Italy won the war was because, well, they cheated. You may ask, again, it's all fair in love and war. How can one cheat when it comes to war? Let me explain. On the 22nd of August, 1864, the first Geneva Convention was signed into existence, and Italy was one of the countries that agreed to the Geneva Conventions, which was a set of rules governing how war should be conducted. These were laws made to protect people that were not part of war. The rules mentioned that civilians should be protected, that people had the rights to receive care that they needed. It mentioned that the Red Cross must be identified and never targeted, and to do so was a war crime. And every single rule in the Geneva Conventions was breached by Italy, whilst the world stood still and did nothing. Obviously, the Geneva Conventions apply to everyone except Africa. The use of chemical weapons by Italy was abused, and this was against the rules of war. This also was Italy's chief strategy to maintain their dignity, and was the only path that they saw towards victory. Considering that Ethiopia lost the war, does this mean that they were colonized? Many may argue so, but the truth is, no. Colonization. The action and process of establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. Colonization is accompanied by imposing power and control. Italy was able to occupy Ethiopia and impose power, but the ladder of control they did not have over Ethiopia. Italy was not able to exert control due to a nationwide patriotic confrontation, and for this, Ethiopia paid the ultimate price. And this is significant. Of all the African kingdoms that I've come across while studying, I've not seen one that responded towards colonization the way Ethiopia did. Immediately after such massacres pursued, the complete control of that kingdom came afterwards. In Ethiopia, the contrary was so. From the very beginning, Italy faced stern resistance. Ethiopia said, "If you want to stay here, we'll make it as uncomfortable for you as possible." And Italy did everything to maintain a stronghold, from familiarizing themselves with notable detractors who opposed Emperor Haile Selassie, to even paying and giving a higher role to those who pledged allegiance to Italy and this new annexed colony that they're trying to create. Although the war Italy waged against Ethiopia was officially over, it wasn't. Ethiopia was like, "Nah, bro, we're just getting started." Okay, they didn't say that, but You get the idea. They referred to this movement as the Patriotic Resistance, and this consisted of a multitude of rebellions and attacks on multiple Italian figures present in Ethiopia. A lot of these attacks were successful and others weren't. Those that failed were followed by a swift execution of everyone involved, February 19, 1937. In an attempt to sustain their freedom. One of such attacks took place and failed. In retaliation, Italian soldiers embarked on a swift and indiscriminate massacre, ranging from various cities within the country. This was referred to as the Griziani Massacre, where 30,000 Ethiopians were killed, most of whom were children, women, religious leaders, monks, deacons, the elderly, the sick. No one was safe. What makes this different from the rest of the war crimes Europe carried out on the African continent was the speed and odious to which it was carried out. Permit me to pause here for a second. When the story of Africa is being told, it is usually told from a short-sighted, uninformed perspective. One thing that I failed to mention in this massacre was that these 30,000 people who were killed were all killed within 3 days. After flooding the streets of people, the soldiers would set fire to houses and point their weapons at those who dared to escape the fire. This was a whole town, a whole city, littered with carcass. When I read up on the story of Africa, 10,000, 30,000, these are all recurring numbers. Numbers that are sufficient enough to scare an entire civilization into submission. This is the final nail on the coffin to yield a colony. And those who suffered the most were not soldiers. These were civilians, farmers, teachers, and children. I hate to be graphic on this channel, but I think this is important to mention because it wraps our minds around how possible it is for a small continent to take over the entire world. And it also puts many inconsistent fallacies that we may have about Africa into perspective. As if this was not enough, Ethiopia did not surrender here. Italy being humiliated in the First War and their inability to colonize Ethiopia doubled down even more. I'm sorry, but I don't know how to put this into words. Ethiopia was willing to fight to the last man standing. Ethiopia launched more and more and more and more attacks and made it hell for the Italians. Their attacks became more strategic and coordinated. They went after their lines of communication, food and water supply, their modes of transportation, their camps. They sent out a clear message to the Italians that you are not safe here. This was a nationwide movement and everyone was involved. You don't get it. Everyone. They armed themselves by looting weapons from Italian soldiers that they ambushed. Those who could not fight provided food and shelter for those who could. Ethiopian women are the greatest women on the planet. They played amongst the greatest roles in destabilizing the Italian forces in their country. They were viewed by the Italians as less of a threat and they used it to their advantage. They were spies, conveying confidential information to the resistance, strategically arranging assassinations of notable Italian figures. They stole weapons, intelligence, anything that they could use to remove the fog of war and to turn the tides of the battle. In many cases, because of the intelligence that they had gathered, they organized their own battalion to launch various ambushes and secret assassinations. This was not one organized movement. These were independent sleeper cells, doing whatever it is that they can to sustain their dignity, bringing to life Emperor Teto's prophecy. We too must retain our dignity. You want other countries to see Ethiopia as your protege, but that will never be. The story of Ethiopia cannot be concluded without talking about the European tribal wars too. Let me know in the comments if you heard what I just did there. Many World War II articles and resources will mention that it was the British who aided Ethiopia to drive the Italians out. That's not necessarily true. It was Nigeria. The only reason Britain gets credit for this is because they colonized Nigeria. In my previous video titled, "What will Africa look like if it was never colonized?" I mentioned of how Nigeria was responsible for the fastest military retreat in human history. In the liberation of Ethiopia was where this took place. Ethiopia had already made it uncomfortable for the Italians, and Nigeria came in to deliver the final blow. The likes of Ethiopia is a symbol of African pride and a hint of African unity, saying that Ethiopia is the only African country to never be colonized. It is an injustice to their sacrifice, and we'll be remiss if we don't mention the immense sacrifice that Ethiopia went through to sustain their freedom. This video is not over. Click this video to have a full understanding of the sacrifice that Ethiopia went through. And this is needed to properly contextualize the events that took place leading to their liberation.